The first helicopter never made it. It didn't crash. It didn't take fire. It simply turned back, swallowed by a wall of dust that no satellite had warned them about. 30,000 feet above the Iranian desert, the MC-130E Combat Talon cut through black sky without lights, its terrain following radar hugging the Earth at 250 knots. Inside, operators from Delta Force, 1st SFODD, sat in silence, oxygen masks tight against their faces, weapons secured between their knees. No one spoke. They already knew the margin for error was gone. Below them, the desert moved. Not sand, not terrain, something else. A dense, airborne mass. A haboob, thick enough to blind pilots, fine enough to choke engines. They had planned for resistance, for Iranian Revolutionary Guards, for urban combat in Tehran. They had not planned for the air itself to turn against them. 8 RH-53D Sea Stallion helicopters had launched from the USS Nimitz hours earlier, crossing 600 miles of open water before hitting the Iranian coast at low altitude. Navy pilots, trained for maritime operations, now flying deep inland over featureless desert in near-zero visibility. No landmarks, no horizon, just instruments and trust. 2 helicopters were already gone. One turned back with a failed rotor blade warning system. Another lost inside the storm, its pilot disoriented, forced to abort. No redundancy left. At Desert 1, the remote staging site carved out of Iranian emptiness, the remaining aircraft began to arrive. One by one. Late. Out of sequence. Covered in dust so fine it coated turbine blades and seeped into avionics. Delta operators disembarked into 38 degrees Celsius heat, boots sinking slightly into soft sand. Night vision was useless. The air itself reflected light. They were still hours from Tehran. And already, the plan was breaking. Colonel Charles Beckwith, commanding Delta Force on the ground, didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The number spoke for him. Minimum required helicopters, 6. They had 5. Above them, Air Force EC-130 tankers waited with engines running, burning fuel every second. Timing windows were closing. Iranian patrol routes would shift at dawn. Thulmedani traffic on nearby roads, already an unexpected variable, had forced them to detain a civilian bus at gunpoint. Nothing about this was clean. Nothing about this was controlled. They had everything. Aircraft carriers, precision navigation, the most advanced special operations unit the United States had ever built. And still, before a single shot was fired, the mission was already slipping beyond their reach. They still tried to make it work. Because that's what the system does when it's already in motion. It doesn't stop. It recalculates. Inside the EC-130 command aircraft, orbiting above the desert in a controlled pattern, the chain of command stretched across continents. Tactical decisions were being made in fragments. Colonel Beckwith on the ground. Major General James Vaught overseeing the Joint Task Force. Washington, thousands of miles away, waiting for confirmation that the plan was still viable. No one owned the failure yet. They only owned the next decision. On paper, the operation had been airtight. Delta Force would assault the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. Army Rangers would secure the nearby airfield at Mansouriya. Air Force MC-130s and EC-130s would handle infiltration and refueling. Navy RH-53D Sea Stallions, launched from the USS Nimitz, would transport the assault force from Desert 1 to Desert 2, a concealed hide site closer to Tehran. The Central Intelligence Agency had built human networks inside the city. Iranian assets, safe houses, drivers, couriers, everything connected. Until it didn't. The helicopters were the first fracture. The RH-53D Sea Stallion was never designed for this. It was a minesweeping platform. Heavy, complex, sensitive to environmental conditions. Its engines required clean airflow. Its avionics struggled in dense particulate environments. And now it was flying through a desert storm that no one had accounted for. By the time the 5th helicopter limped into Desert 1, its hydraulic systems were already compromised. Warning lights flickered inside the cockpit. Flight engineers ran checks under red light, their gloves coated in fine dust that had worked its way into seals and joints. They didn't say the word failure. They just kept testing. Time kept moving. The plan required synchronization down to the minute. The helicopters had to refuel, load Delta operators, and depart before first light. From there, they would fly 260 miles to Desert 2, hide during the day, then launched the final assault into Tehran the following night. 2 nights, 2 phases, 0 margin. Now they were behind schedule. Aircraft were missing. Systems were degrading. And still, the question wasn't whether to abort. It was whether they could continue with less. On the ground, Beckwith moved between aircraft, speaking directly to pilots, not through intermediaries. He understood something the broader system didn't. This wasn't about numbers on a briefing slide. This was about physical capacity. 5 helicopters meant reduced lift. Reduced lift meant fewer operators per wave. Fewer operators meant slower clearance of the embassy compound, an urban environment with multiple buildings, unknown internal layouts, and the constant risk of civilian presence. The plan had been built for speed, shock, overwhelming force. Now it was becoming something else. Slower, thinner, exposed. Inside the command structure, the conversation shifted. Could they redistribute personnel? Could they reduce the assault force? Could they prioritize hostages instead of full compound control? Each adjustment created new gaps, and every gap had consequences. Meanwhile, the environment kept applying pressure. A fuel truck appeared on the nearby road. Unplanned, unscheduled. It didn't stop. Rangers moved to intercept, weapons raised. The driver didn't comply. A warning shot turned into a disabling shot. The truck erupted into flames, lighting the desert with a column of fire visible for miles. Now the landing zone wasn't dark anymore. Now it was a signal. Minutes later, a civilian bus approached. 40-plus passengers. Local Iranians traveling through a place they weren't supposed to notice. Delta operators detained them, zip-tying hands, moving them away from the aircraft. No casualties. But the problem wasn't violence. It was exposure. The mission depended on invisibility. And invisibility was gone. Above them, the EC-130 continued burning fuel. Every minute on the ground reduced the window for extraction. Iranian air defenses would activate at dawn. Radar coverage would tighten. The margin for surprise, already fragile, was collapsing. Then the 6th helicopter arrived. Late. Damaged. Its pilot reporting severe hydraulic failure. Now they had 6. But one of them couldn't fly a second leg. The math didn't change. Still 5 operational. Still below minimum. Inside the cockpit of the EC-130, the mission commander relayed the numbers up the chain. The response came back filtered, cautious, incomplete. No one issued a direct order. Because the system had been built to execute, not to stop. On the ground, Beckwith didn't wait for permission to understand the reality. He gathered his officers. Short conversation. No theatrics. 5 helicopters. Minimum required. 6. Distance to Tehran, over 200 miles. Urban assault complexity. High. Extraction risk, increasing. He had seen this before. Not in Iran. Not like this. But the pattern was familiar. A plan designed in controlled conditions, now colliding with variables it couldn't absorb. They had trained for resistance. They had rehearsed for contingencies. They had not rehearsed for cumulative degradation. Not like this. And still, the system hesitated. Because everything leading up to this moment had reinforced one assumption. That capability equals control. They had the aircraft. They had the men. They had the intelligence. So they believed they could adjust. They believed they could push through. But the desert had already made its decision. It just hadn't told them yet. The system didn't fail in the desert. It failed long before the first helicopter lifted off the deck of the USS Nimitz. What happened at Desert 1 was only the visible part. The part that could be photographed. The part that could be explained to Congress. But the real fracture was structural. It was built into the plan. They believed the problem was distance. Tehran was deep inland. Over 600 miles from the carrier group. Beyond the reach of conventional rotary wing insertion. Beyond simple logistics. So they solved for distance. Multiple staging points. Desert 1. Desert 2. A layered insertion model using MC-130E combat talons for infiltration and EC-130s for forward refueling. Navy RH-53D Sea Stallions bridging the gap between sea and city. A complex solution to a measurable problem. But distance was never the real constraint. Control was. The operation depended on precision timing across 4 separate military branches that did not normally operate together at this level of integration. U.S. Air Force Special Operations crews flying low-level penetration profiles. U.S. Navy helicopter pilots trained for maritime environments, now navigating featureless desert at night. Army Rangers tasked with securing an airfield they had never physically seen. Delta Force preparing for a close-quarters battle inside a dense urban embassy compound with incomplete internal layouts. And above all of them, a command structure that stretched from the desert floor to Washington. Each layer added capability. Each layer removed control. No single commander owned the entire system. Colonel Beckwith controlled Delta on the ground. The Air Force controlled the fixed-wing insertion and refueling. The Navy controlled the helicopters. Intelligence flowed separately through CIA channels, often delayed, sometimes incomplete. Decisions had to move up and down this structure before they could take effect. And time, in this operation, was not flexible. It was absolute. The planners compensated with redundancy. 8 helicopters for a minimum requirement of 6. Multiple refueling aircraft. Alternate routes. Contingency timelines. They believed redundancy would absorb friction. But redundancy only works when failures are independent. These were not. The same environment affected every helicopter. The same dust infiltrated every system. The same visibility conditions disoriented every pilot. Failure was not isolated. It was systemic. The planners had assumed that technology could map the environment. Satellite imagery, weather forecasts, navigation systems. But the desert didn't behave like a map. The haboob wasn't tracked in real time. The density of airborne sand wasn't reflected in the data. The pilots encountered it only when they were already inside it. At low altitude, at night, with no visual horizon, they believed they understood the terrain. They understood its shape, not its behavior. And that distinction is where the operation began to collapse. The helicopters were the most fragile link, but they were treated as a stable variable. They had range. They had lift capacity. They had been tested. But not in this combination of conditions. Not at this scale. Not with this level of dependency. Every phase of the mission depended on them. Insertion to Desert 2. Movement toward Tehran. Extraction of hostages. Without the helicopters, Delta Force was just a ground unit stranded in hostile territory, over 200 miles from the objective. There was no alternative mobility. No secondary airframe. No ground convoy option that could move fast enough without detection. The entire operation balanced on a single capability. And that capability had never been stress-tested against the environment it was about to enter. The intelligence picture had the same flaw. The CIA had developed assets inside Tehran. Safe houses had been identified. Routes had been mapped. The embassy compound had been studied. But this was static intelligence. It described what the environment looked like, not how it would react. They knew where the hostages were believed to be held. They did not know how quickly Iranian Revolutionary Guard units could mobilize once the assault began. They had estimates. They had timelines. But estimates assume compliance from reality. Reality doesn't negotiate. The plan assumed that once Delta breached the embassy, they would have enough time to locate, secure, and extract all hostages before Iranian forces could organize a coordinated response. That assumption was never tested under real conditions, because it couldn't be. Instead, it was accepted, repeated in briefings, reinforced through rehearsal, until it stopped being an assumption and became a fact. This is how systems fail, not through a single mistake, but through a series of reinforced beliefs, each one logical, each one supported by data, each one slightly disconnected from reality. They believed coordination could replace unity of command. They believed redundancy could replace resilience. They believed technology could replace understanding. And most of all, they believed that if every component performed as expected, the system would succeed. But no component was independent. Not the helicopters. Not the timing. Not the intelligence. Everything was connected, which meant everything could fail at the same time. And when it did, there was no mechanism to adapt, only to continue, or to stop. By the time they reached Desert 1, the system was already operating outside its design limits. They just hadn't admitted it yet. What they needed was not more aircraft, not more fuel, not more contingency branches on a briefing slide. They needed a different way to think. Because the problem was no longer mechanical. It was conceptual. Inside the U.S. military at the time, special operations did not exist as a unified doctrine. Delta Force, first SFODD, had only been operational for a few years. It was modeled on the British Special Air Service, but it operated inside a system that still thought in conventional terms. Mass, firepower, sequential planning. Operation Eagle Claw reflected that mindset. It was built like a conventional assault stretched across distance. Phase 1, Phase 2, Phase 3, each dependent on the last, each requiring perfect execution. But the SAS had learned something different in places like Oman and Northern Ireland. They did not build operations around perfection. They built them around tolerance. Tolerance for failure. Tolerance for delay. Tolerance for incomplete information. If one element failed, the operation didn't collapse. It shifted. That philosophy was absent in the desert. There was no lateral flexibility, no independent maneuver elements, no decentralized execution once the system began to degrade. Everything flowed toward a single point of failure, the helicopters, and the helicopters flowed through a single staging site. Desert 1. That was the design. Centralized, controlled, efficient, on paper. But control requires stability, and the environment was not stable. The SAS had faced similar constraints before, but they approached them differently. In Dhofar, during the Omani insurgency, SAS squadrons didn't rely on large synchronized insertions. They operated in small four-man patrols, building human intelligence networks over months. They moved slowly, quietly, often on foot, sometimes living among local tribes. They accepted time as a variable, not a constraint. In Northern Ireland, SAS units working under Task Force 14 Intelligence Company, later known as the DET, did not storm targets blindly. They watched, waited, built patterns. They let the target reveal itself before acting. They reduced uncertainty before committing force. Eagle Claw did the opposite. It compressed uncertainty into a narrow window, then tried to overpower it with speed. The Americans believed speed would protect them. Speed would prevent detection. Speed would compensate for incomplete intelligence. But speed requires clarity, and they didn't have it. They had fragments. They had estimates. They had assumptions reinforced by repetition. What they didn't have was adaptive control. No unit on the ground could independently reshape the mission once conditions changed. Delta Force could not alter the insertion plan. The helicopter pilots could not change their routing once airborne without risking disorientation. The Air Force crews could not extend loiter time indefinitely without compromising extraction. Every element was locked into a pre-approved sequence. Even the decision to abort had to move up the chain. From Desert 1 to the Airborne Command Post. From there to Higher Command. And ultimately to the National Command Authority. Time moved faster than decisions. That's the difference between a plan and a system. A plan assumes compliance. A system assumes resistance. The British had spent decades operating inside resistance. Empire had taught them that terrain lies, that intelligence degrades, that local dynamics shift faster than reports can capture. So they built units that could function with partial control. Eagle Claw was built on the opposite belief, that if enough variables were controlled, the outcome would follow. They controlled what they could measure: aircraft numbers, fuel loads, distances, timelines. But they did not control the interaction between those variables. They did not control how a sandstorm would affect multiple aircraft simultaneously. They did not control how a delayed arrival would cascade through the entire timeline. They did not control how civilian presence would compromise secrecy. They believed control could be engineered. But control in warfare is negotiated, continuously, and often lost. The absence of a unified Special Operations Command made this worse. There was no single authority like a future Joint Special Operations Command to integrate air, ground, and intelligence under one operational doctrine. Instead, each branch optimized for its own role. The Navy ensured the helicopters could launch from the carrier. The Air Force ensured the fixed-wing insertion could reach Desert 1. Delta Force prepared for the assault inside Tehran. Each component worked individually, but integration was assumed, not proven. And assumptions, once embedded into planning, become invisible. No one questions them, because they are no longer seen as assumptions. They are seen as reality. The SAS didn't assume integration. They built it at the smallest level, patrol by patrol, operator by operator. D-experience, D-risk, D-decision-making authority. If a patrol in Northern Ireland lost contact with command, it didn't stop. It adapted. If a surveillance operation in Oman lost its supply line, it didn't abort immediately. It reconfigured. Eagle Claw had no such elasticity. When the helicopters failed, the system didn't adapt. It hesitated. It recalculated. It searched for a way to preserve the original plan, because the plan was the only thing holding the system together. Once the plan broke, there was nothing underneath it. No secondary doctrine. No fallback philosophy. Only the realization, slow, reluctant, that the mission could no longer achieve its objective. And that realization did not come all at once. It came in fragments. A missing helicopter, a delayed arrival, a mechanical warning, a burning fuel truck, each one small enough to justify continuation, until they weren't. By the time the system recognized the pattern, it was already inside it. And there was no clean way out. Only a decision that no one wanted to make. Because stopping meant admitting that everything leading up to this moment had been built on the wrong understanding. And systems don't fail easily. They resist that. Conclusion. Even when the evidence is already in front of them, they didn't announce the abort. Not at first. It began as a pause. A delay measured in minutes that felt longer because everything around it was already moving too fast. Engines running. Fuel burning. Men waiting for orders that hadn't been decided yet. Inside the EC-130, the aircrew monitored fuel flow rates down to the pound. Every minute on the ground consumed extraction margins. They were no longer planning the assault. They were calculating how to survive leaving. On the desert floor, Colonel Beckwith stood between aircraft, his boots grinding fine sand into the metal surface of the landing strip. The wind had picked up again, not strong enough to ground aircraft, but enough to keep the air thick. Visibility fluctuated between clear and opaque in seconds. 5 helicopters. The number didn't change. The 6th, the one that had arrived late, sat off to the side. Its hydraulic system was compromised. Not completely failed, just unreliable. In controlled conditions, maybe it could have flown. This wasn't controlled. Beckwith didn't argue for continuation. He didn't need to. He understood the mission as a system, not as a sequence. The helicopters weren't just transport. They were the spine. Remove one vertebra, the structure bends. Remove another, it collapses. The request moved upward. Abort. It didn't travel instantly. Nothing in this system did. From the ground to the airborne command element. From there to higher authority. The words passed through multiple layers, each one adding a fraction of delay, each one removing ownership. By the time the decision came back down, it wasn't a surprise. It was confirmation. Abort the mission. No assault on Tehran. No movement to Desert 2. Everything would reverse. And reversal, in a system this complex, is not simple. The helicopters had to be refueled for the return flight to the USS Nimitz. Delta operators had to reboard the MC-130s. Equipment had to be accounted for, redistributed, secured. All of it under time pressure. All of it in an environment that had already proven it could degrade systems without warning. The first signs of breakdown didn't come from the plan. They came from the process of leaving it. The RH-53D helicopters were repositioning for refueling. Each aircraft needed to taxi into position near the EC-130, align precisely, maintain rotor clearance, and hold steady while fuel lines were connected. Night operations. Limited. Visibility. Dust still in the air. The pilots were experienced, but they were operating outside their normal domain. No ship deck. No clear horizon. No stable visual references. Just rotating blades, dim lights, and shifting shadows in a desert that absorbed depth perception. One of the helicopters, Bluebeard 3, began to move into position. Its pilot, Lieutenant Commander James McDonough, relied on visual cues that were already compromised. Dust reflected light unpredictably. Distances collapsed. What looked like separation was not. The EC-130 it approached was not a small target. It was a massive aircraft. Stationary. Engines running. But in that environment, size didn't translate to clarity. Inside the helicopter cockpit, the crew coordinated movement in tight, controlled language. Inches mattered. Rotor clearance margins were minimal. Then the reference point disappeared. Not physically. Perceptually. The pilot lost depth. For a fraction of a second. That was enough. The rotor blade struck the tail of the EC-130. There was no gradual failure. No warning. Impact translated instantly into catastrophe. The rotor disintegrated, fragments slicing into the fuselage of the EC-130. Fuel ignited. A fireball erupted, cutting through the darkness with a violent clarity that the operation had lacked from the beginning. Men inside the EC-130 had seconds. Some escaped. Some didn't. The explosion killed 8 servicemen. Air Force crew. Marine helicopter personnel. They were not part of the assault force. They were part of the system that made the assault possible. And now the system was burning. Secondary explosions followed as ammunition and fuel cooked off. The desert, moments ago a staging ground, became a hazard zone. Flames illuminated the entire area, visible from miles away. Secrecy was no longer compromised. It was irrelevant. Delta operators moved instinctively, pulling survivors away from the wreckage, establishing distance, accounting for personnel. There was no confusion about what to do in that moment. The confusion had existed before. Now it was gone. What remained was clarity. The mission was over. The priority shifted completely. Survival, extraction, containment. The remaining helicopters were abandoned. There was no time to recover them. Sensitive equipment had to be destroyed or left behind. Documents, radios, anything that could not be carried was either removed or rendered unusable. The MC-130s prepared for immediate departure. Engines had never been shut down. That decision, made earlier to preserve time, now became the difference between leaving and staying. Men boarded quickly, not in formation, not according to the original load plan. There was no plan left to follow. Only space. Only weight limits. Only the need to get airborne before dawn. The burning wreckage of the EC-130 and RH-53D cast long shadows across the desert. The heat was intense, even at distance. Fuel continued to burn, sending a column of smoke into the night sky. No one spoke about the hostages. Not now. That objective had already receded. What remained was the cost of trying. As the MC-130 lifted off, its cargo bay filled with operators, survivors, and the silence that follows a system collapse, the desert below still held the evidence. 5 intact helicopters. 1 destroyed. A burned-out transport aircraft. Bodies left behind because there was no time. The plan had required precision. The exit required abandonment. And somewhere in the transition between those two states, the illusion of control disappeared completely. They had entered the desert believing they could manage every variable. They left understanding that they had never controlled any of them. The mission ended before it reached Tehran, but its consequences did not. By the time the surviving MC-130E combat Talons cleared Iranian airspace, the operation had already transformed from a covert rescue attempt into an international signal. The burning wreckage at Desert 1 remained behind. 5 intact RH-53D Sea Stallions, 1 destroyed, and the charred remains of an EC-130. Equipment, documents, and bodies that could not be recovered in time. At first light, Iranian forces arrived. Not elite units. Not specialized counter-terror formations. Local Revolutionary Guards. Security personnel. Men with limited training but immediate access to the site. They didn't need precision. They needed presence. What they found was enough. The helicopters were still operational. U.S. markings visible. Equipment left behind in the chaos of extraction. The scale of the attempt was immediately clear. This was not a reconnaissance mission. This was an invasion attempt that had failed before contact. The narrative wrote itself. Inside Iran, the discovery reinforced everything the regime had been saying. That the United States would act directly. That sovereignty would be violated. That confrontation was inevitable. They didn't have to construct that message. The desert had done it for them. The hostages remained inside the embassy in Tehran. Unmoved. Unrescued. The operation had not reached them. Which meant nothing had changed operationally. But strategically, everything had shifted. The United States had revealed capability without achieving effect. It had demonstrated reach, but not control. And that distinction matters. Because power, when displayed without success, becomes something else. It becomes a signal of limitation. Within hours, images of the wreckage began to circulate. Iranian media documented the site. Helicopters abandoned in the desert. Burned aircraft. Evidence of a plan that had been precise in design and incomplete in execution. There was no ambiguity. No plausible deniability. The operation had failed publicly. In Washington, the response moved through the same structure that had controlled the mission. Reports. Debriefings. Initial assessments. But this time, there was no need to interpret partial data. The outcome was binary. The hostages were still captive. 8 servicemen were dead. The operation had been aborted under pressure and then degraded further during withdrawal. The president was informed. The decision to authorize the mission had been made at the highest level. Now the result returned to that same point. Not as a question, as a consequence. There was no immediate second attempt. No rapid follow-on operation. Because the system that had produced Eagle Claw could not regenerate quickly. It required coordination across branches that had not yet learned how to integrate. It required assets that had just been proven vulnerable. It required assumptions that no longer held. So the response shifted. From action to containment. from rescue to negotiation. Time, which had been treated as a constraint during planning, now became the only available tool. The hostages would remain in captivity for months, not because extraction was impossible, but because the system that attempted it had exposed its own limitations. Inside the military, the effect was more precise. Units began to analyze not just what had happened, but how it had happened. The helicopter crews reviewed environmental data that had never been fully integrated into planning models. Air Force operators examined the timing dependencies between aircraft that had been assumed manageable. Delta Force evaluated insertion assumptions that had depended entirely on external mobility. Each unit saw its own piece, but the pattern only became clear when, viewed as a whole, the failure had not occurred at the point of execution. It had been embedded in the structure, and now that structure had been exposed. The desert had not defeated them. It had revealed them. The failure did not end at Desert 1. It moved, quietly, into doctrine, into structure, into the way the United States would think about war for the next 4 decades. Because what happened in that desert was not a tactical anomaly. It was a structural exposure. They had built a system that required perfection, then sent it into an environment that guaranteed friction. And when friction appeared, the system didn't bend. It broke. After Eagle Claw, the first realization was not about helicopters. It was about command. Too many layers. Too many approvals. Too much distance between decision and execution. At Desert 1, the men closest to the problem could see it clearly. 5 helicopters. Insufficient lift. Compromised timeline. They understood the reality in minutes. But the system required that reality to travel upward, be processed, confirmed, returned as an order. By the time authority aligned with understanding, time had already been lost. That delay wasn't accidental. It was designed. A product of a military structure optimized for large-scale conventional warfare, where decisions moved deliberately, not instantly. Eagle Claw proved that model didn't survive contact with special operations. So they changed it. Not immediately, not cleanly, but permanently. In 1980, the United States did not have a unified Special Operations Command. By 1987, it did. United States Special Operations Command, USACOM, was created to centralize authority, funding, and doctrine. But more important than the organization was what sat inside it. A different philosophy, one that accepted what Eagle Claw had denied. That control is always incomplete. That coordination cannot rely on distance. That the unit executing the mission must also hold the authority to adapt it. JSOC, the Joint Special Operations Command, emerged as the operational expression of that idea. Delta Force, SEAL Team 6, DevGRU, the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, Air Force Special Tactics, all placed under a structure designed not for sequential execution, but for integrated action. The helicopter problem was addressed too, not by replacing aircraft alone, but by changing how aviation integrated with ground forces. The 160th SOAR, the Night Stalkers, were built specifically to solve the gap. Eagle Claw exposed. Pilots trained for low-level, night infiltration over hostile terrain, desert, mountains, urban environments. They didn't operate as a supporting element. They operated as part of the assault force. De-training, de-mission planning, de-risk. The aircraft became an extension of the unit, not a separate dependency. Intelligence changed as well. Static reports were no longer enough. Units like Task Force Orange focused on signals intelligence that could adapt in real time. Human intelligence networks were no longer treated as background support. They became operational drivers. Targets were not just identified. They were studied, patterned, understood over time. The SAS had operated like this for decades. Now the Americans were learning it the hard way. Time, once compressed, was expanded. Operations became slower in preparation, faster in execution, more flexible under pressure. The idea was not to eliminate friction. That was impossible. The idea was to survive it. Eagle Claw also changed how failure was interpreted. Before, failure was often attributed to execution. Something went wrong. A mistake. A miscalculation. After Eagle Claw, failure was examined as a system. Not what went wrong in the moment, but what made that moment inevitable. The assumption that helicopters would remain reliable under untested environmental conditions. The belief that multiple branches could synchronize perfectly without a unified command. The expectation that speed could compensate for incomplete understanding. These were not execution errors. They were design decisions. And design decisions, once exposed, don't get corrected by training. They get corrected by changing the system. That change didn't make future operations flawless. Nothing does. But it altered the balance. When JSOC planned missions years later, Panama, Iraq, Afghanistan, the structure was different. Authority was closer to the ground. Aviation was integrated from the start. Intelligence updated continuously, not periodically. Contingencies were not just branches. They were parallel options. If one path failed, another already existed. Not perfectly, but sufficiently. The system no longer depended on a single point holding. It distributed risk. Eagle Claw had concentrated it. All movement through Desert 1. All reliance on the RH-53D. All timing compressed into a narrow window. One failure became multiple. Multiple failures became systemic. And the system had no elasticity. That was the lesson. Not that the mission was too ambitious, but that it was too rigid. Too dependent on conditions that could not be guaranteed. Too confident in variables that had not been fully understood. They had everything. Aircraft carriers. Advanced navigation. The most selective unit the U.S. military had ever fielded. And still, none of it translated into control. Because control was never about assets. It was about alignment. Between reality and design. Between environment and expectation. Between what they thought would happen and what actually did. After Eagle Claw, they stopped assuming those two things were the same. They started building systems that expected them to diverge. That could absorb that divergence. Adapt to it. Exploit it. That shift didn't erase the failure. The 8 men who died at Desert 1 were not part of a lesson. They were part of a cost. A cost that revealed something the system had refused to see. That power, without understanding, is unstable. And when instability meets complexity, it doesn't degrade gradually. It collapses. The desert didn't defeat them. It didn't need to. It only had to exist exactly as it was. Everything else, they did to themselves.